You sit there in silence, wondering how someone who once felt so close can now feel like a distant memory. You question your worth, you question your impact, you replay moments, searching for where it all went wrong. But listen carefully, because what you feel is not always what is true. You feel forgotten, but they are not free. You see, an avoidant does not love the way you love. They do not express the way you express. Where you lean in, they pull away. Where you seek clarity, they seek space. And in that space, you assume absence. But absence is not emptiness. It is restraint. It is fear. It is a heart that learned, long before you arrived, that closeness comes with a cost. So instead of running toward connection, they run from it. Not because you meant nothing, but because you meant too much. Yes, that is the paradox you must understand. The deeper they feel, the stronger the instinct to withdraw. The more real it becomes, the more their inner world begins to panic. Because love to them is not just warmth, it is exposure. It is risk. It is the loss of control they've spent a lifetime trying to maintain. So they disappear. And you interpret that disappearance as rejection. But what if I told you they're thinking of you in the quiet moments, in the spaces where no one is watching, in the late hours where distractions fade and truth rises to the surface? They remember your voice, your energy, the way you saw them beyond their walls, and that is exactly what unsettles them. Because you didn't just touch their life, you touched the part of them they've been trying to hide, and now they are torn. Torn between the desire to come closer and the instinct to protect themselves, so they choose distance. Not because you are forgettable, but because you are unforgettable in a way that feels dangerous to them. But here is where your power returns. You must not shrink yourself to fit their fears. You must not chase someone who is running from their own emotions. Because the moment you begin to chase, you confirm their deepest belief, that love is pressure, that connection is overwhelming, that closeness takes away their freedom, and that pushes them further away. Instead, you rise. You become grounded in your own presence. You stop asking, "Why am I not enough?" and start declaring, "I am already whole," because your worth was never determined by their ability to stay. And something powerful happens when you step into that truth. The energy shifts. The absence they once controlled becomes your silence. The distance they created becomes your detachment. And suddenly, the dynamic changes. Because now, they feel what you once felt. The wondering, the curiosity, the quiet pull back toward you, not because you forced it, but because you released it. You see, avoidants are not moved by pursuit. They are moved by presence and the absence of pressure. They are drawn to what feels safe, yet intriguing, close, yet not consuming. And when you embody that balance, you become something they cannot easily walk away from. But understand this clearly. This is not about getting them back. This is about getting yourself back, your peace, your dignity, your emotional freedom. Because real power is not in being chosen. It is in choosing yourself so fully that anyone who enters your life must meet you at that level. And if they cannot, you no longer feel forgotten. You simply move forward, knowing you were always more than enough. When someone with avoidant tendencies seems to forget you, what's actually happening beneath the surface is far more complex than simple indifference. Their mind is not wired to process emotional closeness in the same way yours might be. Where you naturally move toward connection, they instinctively move away from it, not because the bond lacks meaning, but because it carries a weight they don't know how to hold safely. So instead of expressing what they feel, they suppress it, not consciously, not maliciously, but as a learned response that once protected them. Suppression is not the absence of emotion. It is the containment of it. It's what happens when someone has learned, often early in life, that emotions overwhelm, complicate, or even threaten their sense of control. So when something or someone begins to matter deeply, their system doesn't lean in with openness. It tightens. It creates distance. It tells them to regain space before they lose themselves. From the outside, this can feel like you've been erased, as if all the moments, all the connection, all the depth you shared has simply vanished from their awareness. But internally, that's rarely the case. What they are doing is pushing those feelings down, compartmentalizing them, placing them somewhere they don't have to confront them directly. Because to confront them would mean to feel them fully. And that's exactly what they've trained themselves to avoid. You might wonder how someone can feel something and yet act like they don't. But for an avoidant, action is not always aligned with emotion. In fact, it's often the opposite. The stronger the feeling, the stronger the need to create space from it. So when you mattered, when you reached a place of emotional significance in their life, that didn't draw them closer in a sustained way. It activated their defense. And this is where the misunderstanding begins. You interpret their distance as a reflection of your value. You assume that if they truly cared, they would show up, communicate, reassure, remain consistent. And in a secure dynamic, that would be true. But here, their inconsistency is not a measure of your worth. It is a reflection of their internal limits. They don't forget you. They manage you. They manage the impact you had on them by reducing exposure to it. They distract themselves, focus on other areas of life, convince themselves they need independence or that something was missing. Anything that allows them to maintain emotional distance. Because closeness to them can feel like losing autonomy, like being pulled into something they cannot regulate. So what looks like neglect is actual irregulation. What feels like being forgotten is actually being placed behind an emotional barrier they rely on to function. And the painful truth is, you may still exist very clearly in their internal world, just not in a way they allow themselves to act on freely. What appears as coldness or detachment is often something far more protective than it is dismissive. Emotional distance, especially in someone with avoidant patterns, is not created to punish you or diminish the bond. It is created to preserve their sense of internal safety. Vulnerability, for them, does not feel like openness or closeness in the way it might for you. It feels like exposure, like standing without armor in a space where they have learned, consciously or unconsciously, that being seen too deeply can lead to discomfort, loss, or even pain. So instead of leaning into emotional intimacy, they regulate it by pulling back. That distance becomes their shield. It allows them to stay connected just enough to not feel alone, but far enough to not feel overwhelmed. And this balance, though confusing to someone on the receiving end, feels necessary for them to maintain control over their emotional world. The root of this response is rarely about the present moment alone. It is often shaped by past experiences where emotional needs were not met consistently, where closeness may have been unpredictable, or where expressing feelings did not feel safe or welcomed. Over time, they adapt by relying on themselves, minimizing dependency, and creating an internal rule. I am safer when I don't need too much from anyone. So when you come into their life offering genuine connection, consistency, and emotional depth, it doesn't just feel comforting. It also challenges that rule. It invites them into a level of closeness they are not fully equipped to sustain. And instead of communicating that discomfort directly, I revert to what feels familiar, distance. You may notice moments where they are warm, engaged, even deeply present. In those moments, their guard lowers, and you see the connection that truly exists. But as soon as that connection deepens beyond what feels manageable, the instinct to withdraw returns. Not because the feeling disappeared, but because it became too real. From your perspective, this can feel like inconsistency or mixed signals. One moment they are there, the next they are gone. One moment they seem invested, the next they appear indifferent. But internally, it is less about confusion and more about regulation. They are constantly adjusting the level of closeness to match what they can handle without feeling overwhelmed. And this is where the misunderstanding intensifies. You may respond by trying to close the gap, reaching out more, seeking clarity, asking for reassurance. But to them, that increased emotional intensity can feel like pressure, even if it's coming from a place of care. And pressure, in their system, triggers the need for even more distance. So the cycle continues: connection, discomfort, withdrawal. It's important to understand that their distance is not a statement about your value or your importance. It is a reflection of how they have learned to navigate emotional intimacy. The space they create is not because you lack something, but because closeness requires something. From them, they are still learning how to give presence without fear, connection without losing themselves, and vulnerability without retreat. What you interpret as indifference is often a quiet storm of contradiction happening beneath the surface. On the outside, they may appear calm, unaffected, even distant to the point where it feels like nothing truly moves them. But internally, There is often a tension between two opposing forces, the desire to connect and the need to protect themselves from that very connection. This is the internal conflict that defines much of their behavior. Part of them wants closeness. They want companionship, understanding, the ease of being with someone who sees them without demanding too much. They feel the pull toward you, especially when the connection is genuine and unforced. There are moments when they allow themselves to lean in, to enjoy your presence, to feel what's naturally there without overanalyzing it. But almost simultaneously, another part of them begins to activate. This part is cautious, alert, and deeply conditioned to maintain independence. It questions the safety of the connection. It wonders what will be expected, what might change, what they might have to give up if things go deeper. And this questioning doesn't always happen in clear, logical thoughts. It often shows up as a feeling, a subtle discomfort, a sense of pressure, an urge to step back without fully understanding why. So while one part of them moves closer, another pulls away. This creates a push and pull dynamic that can feel confusing and even painful to experience. You may sense their interest, their curiosity, even their care, and then suddenly it's as if a switch flips. They become distant, less responsive, harder to read. And because this shift can happen without explanation, it leaves you trying to make sense of something that doesn't follow a consistent pattern, but for them, it does make sense. They are trying to balance connection without losing control. They are trying to feel something without being consumed by it, and when those two goals begin to conflict, protection tends to win over desire. It's not that they don't want you, it's that wanting you creates a vulnerability they are not fully comfortable holding. And so, instead of expressing that conflict openly, they manage it through behavior. They delay responses, limit emotional conversations, or create physical and emotional space. These actions are not always calculated. Often, they are automatic responses shaped by past experiences and reinforced over time. From your side, this can feel like mixed signals or emotional unavailability. You might question whether their feelings were ever real, whether you imagined the connection, whether you somehow misread everything. But the truth is, both sides existed, the connection and the withdrawal. They were real in their presence, and they are real in their distance. And they are real in their distance. The challenge is that their internal world does not operate in a straight line. It moves in cycles, moments of openness followed by retreat, closeness followed by space. And unless they become aware of this pattern within themselves, they will continue to move between these two states without fully integrating them. So what you see as indifference is often a person navigating an internal contradiction they haven't yet learned how to resolve, wanting to come closer while instinctively stepping back at the same time. When you step back, something shifts in a way you may not immediately see, but they feel it. Your absence creates a space that is no longer filled by your presence, your energy, your consistency, and that space has an impact. Not always outwardly, not always in a way they will express, but internally, it begins to move something that was previously kept at a distance. While you were there, available, reaching, engaging, they had the ability to regulate the connection on their terms. They could step in and out, knowing the bond was still accessible. Your presence, though meaningful, was also predictable. And for someone who is used to maintaining control over emotional exposure, that predictability allows them to stay in their comfort zone. But when that presence is removed, even slightly, the dynamic changes. Now there is something they cannot control in the same way. The silence you create is different from the distance they choose. Their distance is intentional. It is a way to manage feelings. But your absence introduces uncertainty. It interrupts the pattern they are familiar with. And in that interruption, something begins to surface. They start to notice what is no longer there, not always consciously at first, but in small, subtle ways. The conversations that don't happen, the energy that is missing, the emotional availability that once existed but is no longer being offered. And because avoidants often suppress feelings rather than process them in real time, your absence can bring those buried emotions closer to the surface. What they once kept contained now has room to expand. This is where longing can begin, not in the form of immediate action, but as a quiet awareness, a recognition of what you brought into their life. A recognition of what you brought into their life. the way you made them feel, even if they didn't fully acknowledge it at the time. And because they are no longer actively managing the connection through distance, they are now left with the experience of it without the same defenses in place. It's not that your absence creates feelings that weren't there. It reveals the ones that were already present but unexpressed. However, this doesn't always translate into outward behavior. They may not suddenly reach out, explain themselves, or openly express what they are feeling. Avoidants are not driven by impulse in the same way others might be. Even when they feel something strongly, they often take time to process it, and even then they may choose to keep it internal. So the longing exists, but it is quiet. It shows up in moments of reflection, in memories that surface unexpectedly, in comparisons they make without fully realizing it. It may appear as curiosity about what you are doing, or a subtle pull to reconnect, even if they don't act on it immediately. And this is where the misunderstanding often happens. You may believe that if they don't act, they don't feel. But for them, feeling and acting are not always connected. They can experience a deep internal response without translating it into external movement. Your absence then becomes something they have to sit with, not avoid, not manage in the same way, but experience in a more direct and unfiltered form. The moment you stop chasing is the moment everything begins to realign, first within you and then, quietly, in the dynamic itself. Not because you are playing a game, not because you are trying to provoke a reaction, but because you are finally stepping out of a position that was draining your sense of self. Chasing often comes from a place of seeking reassurance, clarity, or validation. It feels like effort toward connection, but over time, it can turn into a pattern where your energy is constantly reaching outward, while your own foundation weakens inward. When you shift that energy back to yourself, something stabilizes. You begin to reconnect with your own emotional center instead of orbiting around someone else's inconsistency. And this is where true healing starts, not in changing them, not in decoding their behavior, but in redefining your relationship with your own worth. Self-worth, in this context, is not just a belief. It is a way of being. It's how you carry yourself when there is silence. It's how you respond when there is distance. It's the ability to remain grounded without needing immediate answers or constant reassurance. And when you begin to embody that, your actions naturally change. You stop over-explaining. You stop over-giving. You stop trying to earn consistency from someone who cannot yet provide it. Instead, you become more intentional. You give when it feels, not when it feels necessary to maintain connection. You express yourself without trying to control the outcome. You allow space without rushing to fill it. And in doing so, you create a different kind of presence, one that is calm, steady, and self-contained. This shift is powerful because it removes pressure from the dynamic. Avoidant individuals are highly sensitive to anything that feels like emotional demand, even when it is unspoken. When that pressure is no longer present, they no longer feel the same need to create distance as a form of regulation. The space becomes less about escaping and more about choosing. At the same time, you are no longer waiting in that space. You are living in it. Your focus moves toward your own growth, your own fulfillment, your own emotional clarity. And this is not something that goes unnoticed. Even if they don't immediately respond, the energy they once experienced from you has changed. It is no longer reaching, no longer seeking. It is simply existing. And that kind of presence carries a different weight. It communicates that you are not dependent on their actions to feel secure, that you are not anchored in their responses to feel valuable. And paradoxically, this is what can create a sense of safety for them, because now connection with you no longer feels like something they have to manage or escape from. But more importantly, this shift changes your experience entirely. You are no longer caught in cycles of overthinking or emotional highs and lows based on their behavior. You are not interpreting every silence as rejection or every delay as loss. You are anchored in something deeper, your own sense of completeness. And from that place, your standards become clearer. You begin to recognize what feels aligned and what doesn't. You become less willing to accept inconsistency as something you must tolerate, not out of resentment, but out of clarity. Because when you are grounded in your own worth, you no longer negotiate it in order to maintain a connection. You simply choose what reflects it. Thank you for being here and allowing these words to reach your heart. Goodbye for now. May you walk forward in clarity, strength, and self-worth.